All right, so this week we're looking at the executive branch, and we'll look at the powers of the president, and then what each of those powers, specific role-wise, um, what each of those include. First of all, I'd like you to do a real quick, quick write in our corner there. What does it take to be a great president? And I'll give you the rankings of both historians and political scientists. Remember, historians are a little bit different. Political scientists look at it from a kind of a science or analytical, and historians look at it from an impact of history. So 1 through 4 are the same. Washington number one, Lincoln number one, Washington number two, Franklin Roosevelt number three during the 30s, and Teddy Roosevelt number four during obviously the Progressive era. Where it differs is political scientists rank Jefferson as 5, Truman as 6, Eisenhower as 8, Eisenhower as 7, Obama as 8, Reagan as 10, and Lyndon Baines Johnson as the last. And then historians rank Eisenhower, so President Eisenhower here over on the side, as 5, Truman as number 6, Jefferson as 7, John F. Kennedy as number 8, Reagan as number 10, and LBJ or Lyndon Baines Johnson as number 10. So you can agree or disagree. That's totally up to you. Here's the presidents, and let's see how much you already know. There are my lovely question. Who was the youngest president ever? In the answer to that would be JFK. He was 43. 43 years old, 163 days on election day, the day he was elected. Who was the oldest to ever serve as president would have been Reagan. He was 73 or nearly 74 when he was elected. Donald Trump was 70 on his inauguration. Number 3, who held the presidency for the longest time. I'm sure everyone knows that. That's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was elected to presidency 4 times and then died after his 4th election. And then the 22nd Amendment, as you remember, was ratified in 51 to limit presidential terms to 2. Who held the president for the shortest period of time? Well, that was William Henry Harrison. He died 32 days after the inauguration. And then number 5 there, which president was the first to name an African American to his cabinet? We'll talk about cabinets later. That would have been Lyndon Baines Johnson. He appointed Weaver as president and held that position of Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in 1966. He was the only president as well to take the oath of office from a female official. He took the oath of office from Judge Sarah T. Hughes. Kind of significant there for Lyndon Baines Johnson. And then who was the first president to have a Christmas tree in the White House or light a national Christmas tree? Everyone gets this one wrong, but Franklin Pierce was the first president to have a Christmas tree in the White House. And a fun fact about him, his inaugural address was 3,319 words and given from memory, no notes, just from his memory. And then Calvin Coolidge was the first president to light a national Christmas tree, and that was on the White House lawn in 1923. The White House was officially named, and it was named by Teddy Roosevelt, or at least he usually is given credit for that. Teddy Roosevelt oversaw the creation of what we call the West Wing today, but he also made the White House the official name. In 1800, it was called things like the Presidential Mansion or the President's Palace, the President's House. All of those were tossed around, and Teddy Roosevelt made the White House stick, and it's been known as the White House ever since. Which president served 2 non-consecutive terms? That would have been, of course, Grover Cleveland. He was the only president to serve 2 terms that were not in a row, so making him the 22nd and 24th president of the United States. And then who was the first president to be born in the United States? Yes, the Constitution does say have to be a natural born citizen. However, our first 7 presidents were born before the United States gained its independence. So they were British subjects when they were born. So Martin Van Buren, our 8th president, was born in New York in 1872. Some fun facts. All right. Executive branch as just kind of at a glance. He enforces the law. The executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States of America. He shall hold this office, um, you know, as long as he has been not broken the law. Has a vice president chosen for the same number of terms. They are pass laws and then are delegated to enforce those laws. That is basically where it all comes from. Some quick fun facts before we get to constitutional powers. He makes $400,000 a year. It is tax-free. He has a $50,000 expense account and a $100,000 travel expense account. Lives in the White House for free. Has Secret Service protection for his life. That would be the president and his spouse. There have been some changes to that and some amendments. Nixon relinquished his Secret Service in 1985. He was the only president to have ever done that. They do receive a pension. It is taxable, but they do receive health care for their life. They have a country home, so they have the White House, but they also have a country home called Camp David. And then they have use of Air Force One. And they have a full-time staff of anywhere from 400 to 500 people who are full-time employees of the president. Quick fun note on Air Force One, is more than one, and essentially any airplane that the president is flying on essentially becomes Air Force One and obviously is protected. All right, so filling out our lovely constitutional powers, there are specified powers and then there are inherent powers. This part of our lecture, we're going to talk about specified powers. Those are in Article 1, Section 7. It grants him the veto power, but everything else is in Article 2. So I'm going to talk about each of these, but let's get an overview. Essentially, chief executive, commander-in-chief, head of state, chief diplomat, legislative leader, party leader, and economic leader. And we'll talk about each one of those. Let's start with the chief executive. So chief executive essentially means that he is the head of the government. He is in charge of appointing people, as we looked at once before. He does nominate members of his cabinet. Those are positions that basically serve as his cabinet leaders. President Washington had an advisory cabinet of 4 people. He's the first president to do that. And then since then, it has grown and every president has done that. There are 15 departments in the cabinet. And he has that appointment power. And he is essentially also the head of the executive branch, which also includes the bureaucracy. So, chief of the executive branch enforces laws and federal court decisions, signs treaties, appoints justices and ambassadors, grants pardons, handles national emergencies. So those are all things that are part of his role. This particular picture is President Clinton appointing the first female attorney general, which is one of the cabinet positions, and she is attorney general. She's in charge of the judicial branch. So that would be Janet Reno. She was the first woman to hold that position. The next role is obviously commander-in-chief. That's pretty easy. In charge of the armed forces, controls the military. Obviously here we have President Reagan. Ultimate responsibility to make military decisions. There are 2.7 million men and women in the armed forces, and the nation's entire military arsenal are subject to the president's direct and immediate control. So pretty powerful position. Obviously they have advisors in that department as well. But he is, as they say, the buck stops here. All right, so moving on, I think. Oops. Oh, leader of armed services. And then let's talk a little bit about that. Sorry, the War Powers Resolution, which was passed during Vietnam, gives the president power to commit troops to a foreign war. Or interaction, let's call it defense, for up to 90 days without Congress approval. But any actual declared war would require Congress's approval. He can call an armistice, and he can set up military governments in a foreign land. So those are important aspects of being commander in chief. Head of state, sometimes called chief of state, really interchangeable, performs ceremonial duties. They're the symbolic leader of our country. So they are kind of the symbol of the United States, like it or not. They are the symbol of us. They do dedications. They have commemorations. They decorate military heroes. They light the national Christmas tree if they choose to. They receive or host foreign leaders. They will attend state funerals of other world leaders. They will be our representative over there. Chief diplomat, that obviously is President Jimmy Carter, chief diplomat. He won the Nobel Peace Prize for diplomacy, so I thought this would be an appropriate president example of chief diplomat. He guides our U.S. foreign policy with the Senate. As you saw in your Senate committee review of the text, as well as your web quest, you saw that Senate is foreign policy. That's their big function, is about foreign policy. He does negotiate treaties, but as you saw, treaties are also have to be approved by Senate. He makes agreements with heads of states, negotiations with heads of states. He recognizes foreign countries. During World War II, there were some countries we had not recognized as a country, and FDR recognized them as a country to become allies with them in fighting that war. So it's kind of an important role. Legislative leader. Obviously, Franklin Roosevelt signed quite a few bills into law, so he is the chief legislator. The president is. They act as chief policymaker. They're the main architect of our domestic policy. They have an agenda. They try to get Congress to follow that agenda and pass those laws. He can initiate, suggest, and request certain laws to be enacted in legislation, and he really sets and shapes the overall congressional agenda. So that is kind of an important role for him. Alrighty. So informs Congress, conditions of the nation, directs and proposes legislation, signs, vetoes, and remember, can also pocket veto, so delay that. He can also call special sessions of Congress. If Congress is on recess, he can call in special sessions to deal with issues that are going on. Political leader. So he is the chief party leader. As chief, this is obviously Reagan and Bush. So this would have been Bush as vice president. He is the head of the political party. He attends fundraisers. He can campaign for other party members. Oftentimes he can make appointments that are what we call patronage, so certain appointments within the political party as favors. So kind of an important role. I don't know if the party is always aligned to that, but just generally the president is expected to carry out the party platform, whatever that party platform happens to be. As chief economic leader, he proposes the budget, announces that budget to the United States in his State of the Union address, which is also a congressional duty. And by law, he has to host those lovely State of the Union. So he proposes a budget and he submits an economic annual report, but he does have to work with Congress to write the federal budget, to set tax policies, and as you saw, in the last exercise in WebQuest, that controlling the money supply and keeping the economy growing is absolutely part of Senate and those committee hearings, right? With Senate being Ways and Means, or House Ways and Means committee, and those are an appropriations committee. So both of those committees actually are power of the purse. the president can set a budget, but essentially appropriations and Ways and Means actually delegates that budget and also does the tax code, so revenue. President is chief citizen. Here we have Obama. And essentially chief citizen chief citizen is the representative of all the people. He works for and represents the public interest. So those are kind of the roles and powers. Let's talk about inherent powers. These are a little bit different than the roles and powers that are implicit, right? Outlined specifically. Inherent powers are carry out duties. So they're a little bit blurred. They are oftentimes an expansion of power set as a precedent, and then the next president carries it on. Lincoln did it, Washington did it. Most presidents have done some sort of expansion of powers, claiming it is their inherent power to carry out their duty, just as we saw with Congress doing that. Expansion of powers has set precedent, and legislative powers, economic activity, and executive orders are all examples of that. Wilson, let's look at the formal powers here, and then we'll talk a little bit about some examples. So, constitutional or enumerated powers of the president. It's broad but vague. It is in the executive power clause under sections 2 and 3 in the Constitution. Specified powers is commander-in-chief, appointments, treaties, pardons, reprieves, annual address to the nation, call of special sessions. So some of those powers we just went over are those specific or specified powers, right? Informal sources of powers are these inherent powers. So they are a position. So they come from this idea that you are the position of being president. So the appointment of power, control of the national security apparatus, many of these things are this idea that you are the image and therefore, you are all powerful. And some of those inherent powers come from that. The other two areas it comes from is prestige. Teddy Roosevelt was popular for the bully pulpit, but also in this idea of agenda setting, national interest, or parochial interest, so interests that are innately his, or in the good of a specific area. Popularity, oftentimes the president will rally his inherent powers, as we see with President Trump is doing this quite often, rallying where he goes to the public. In his case, he is tweeting most of his rally calls, or kind of does it around this couched in the flag. So Roosevelt during the Spanish-American War, the splendid little war, we're going to release everyone from the horrors of the evil Spanish. So oftentimes that's where these inherent powers come from. They're assumed by strong presidents, and then that precedent is set. It is a power to persuade. So oftentimes it is leadership skills or political skills. And those skills are extremely important when you have a divided Congress, where you have opposition on the other side of Congress. So if I'm looking at a bully pulpit and I'm setting an agenda, if I don't have a united Congress, I'm going to have a much harder time getting that agenda set. In modern terms, we've seen quite a few divided Congresses where agendas are just really not coming forward. Good, bad, or indifferent, it's just the way the structure seems to work. Let's take a look at expansion of powers. There has been very strong expansion of powers over the course of our history. Obviously, in 1793, the Proclamation of Neutrality. George Washington was famous in not wanting us to get entangled in foreign affairs. So he does do this proclamation in 1793 in April. Actually, the anniversary was just a couple days ago on the 22nd. And basically, he declared the nation neutral in all conflicts between France and Great Britain. It left us out of those wars and out of those proceedings. And also, he was strongly against setting any money to foreign nations for wars that they were proceeding in. Thomas Jefferson, of course, was well, the rest of them, these are all extreme examples of expansion or even if you might call it abuse of power, right? Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the United States when he made the Louisiana Purchase. There is nowhere in the Constitution does the president have the power to buy land from a foreign nation. And that's exactly what we did when we did the Louisiana Purchase, when he sent people over to negotiate the purchase of Louisiana from Napoleon when Napoleon was coming to the end of his reign. So it was definitely an expansion of powers. Certainly, Federalists were very strongly against it, but he used it as an inherent and implied, and therefore it was permissible under the Constitution. And most of the country at that time really wanted to expand, so no one really questioned it. James Polk did this when he went down into the Mexican War. He sends troops down to, quote unquote, the boundary between the United States and Mexico along the Rio Grande. He crosses over and claims that Mexicans attacked U.S. troops, when in reality, we had crossed over the border into their side and actually were invading their side, although we claimed it was our side. So certainly that expansion. Congress basically gave a war message, and we quickly declared war after that. The Mexican-American War is definitely one of those that's complex and hard to understand, but very interesting nonetheless. Abraham Lincoln, during the Civil War, did a couple of things where he issued executive orders calling up state militia for federal military. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. We've talked about that. He authorized the borrowing and spending of money for the Union. We'll talk just a second about his Emancipation Proclamation. So he has quite a few. And then in 2001, the expansion of national security with George W. Bush and the War on Terror, and that was after 9/11, obviously. Second time the United States has been attacked on our soil, Pearl Harbor, and then obviously 9/11. One big example is this Emancipation Proclamation, and essentially Lincoln struggled over the freeing of the slaves and essentially could not get this to pass, and so he does this Emancipation Proclamation. Eventually it does become law with the amendments, and he does it based on the power in him vested as Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy in actual armed rebellion against the authority and government of the United States, which is what the South was. He essentially orders and declares that all persons held as slaves receive an act of justice warranted by the Constitution and military necessity. He invokes the idea that they be free at that point. So the National Security Agency was established under Bush with the War on Terror. And in that act, he also creates the Procedures of Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which is FISA. And essentially it was the idea that he could, in the interest of national security, surveil or conduct surveillance on American citizens living in our country. So there was some protest on it. It wasn't a patriotic act. People didn't like it. They didn't want this idea that the government could be listening in or watching our internet. And I'll let you chime in on that here in a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about executive orders. Executive orders are talked about in your textbook. They are unprecedented. They are legally binding orders. They're given out of the executive branch by the president. They are generally to direct federal agencies to establish laws or policy. It is generally a time where the president doesn't have support of Congress and can't get bills to be passed. So again, example, the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an executive order, expansion of powers, and then the Japanese internment with FDR during World War II, and then Truman during desegregation of armed forces. So three really strong examples. But executive orders are oftentimes just during the term of that president, and then oftentimes are reneged on the next time around. So your example of as executive orders, and I think what's really interesting is that Roosevelt had a tremendous amount. He had 3,522 executive orders and 4,422 days in office. So, you're approaching, almost an order a day. But unprecedented times. Our country was in a tremendous depression, and so it's hard to say good, bad, or indifferent. But looking at the trend, you can see that the average really is pretty consistent between Republicans and Democrats, and given the times of the decade that it was serving. Hopefully, if you actually looked at decades, so a 10-year span, 1980s, 1960s, 1950s, you saw what issues were going on in the country when we did our media activity. And you could see maybe the need for the president to do more than maybe the laws were allowing him to do, or the laws happening. You could see that Obama was the slowest amount of executive orders during his time in office. And Trump, basically, most of the executive orders that Trump has passed, your textbook talks about a couple. Obama's big one was Dreamers, and of course, as soon as Trump came into office, he reversed it. Some of the others your textbook talks about is immigration, which were all blocked by the Supreme Court. However, during Trump's time, just in the first days of office, he broke the record of a decades-long trend and passed more executive orders in his time there in the first few days than pretty much anyone else since Johnson. So 49 in those first days. And most of those were reversals of what Obama had done during his administration. So nothing earth-shattering other than reversals of many things like the Dreamers, immigration restrictions, healthcare, some of those other issues that were implemented for the people. All right, moving right along. Examples of the relationship between Congress and president. Your textbook talks about this during 277 to 279. I wanted to hit on executive privilege because I think sometimes that's confused. Essentially, it is withholding information in the public interest. It is part of the check of Congress overseeing and investigating activities of other branches. So oftentimes Congress is trying to get information, and the president just basically says, nope, executive privilege, I'm not giving you that information. Certainly happened with Obama over certain issues, especially given immigration and healthcare. And with Trump, again, immigration, healthcare, and now impeachment and foreign relations. So every president has invoked executive privilege from time to time. Let's talk about other checks on the president. Checks on the executive office as a whole. The U.S. Senate has approval of all presidential appointments, and Congress controls the budget, as you saw in your committees. As commander-in-chief, the check on the president, only Congress can actually declare war. And remember, you have the War Powers Act, which has some time that the president can actually send troops in. They can occupy for 90 days. Congress has within 48 hours to respond, and then they can extend those powers over 60 days. So Congress can extend those powers. Chief diplomat, the biggest check on chief diplomat is the U.S. Senate ratifies all treaties, and the U.S. Senate also confirms all ambassador appointments. So speaking specifically to powers and that check between House and chief diplomat. Chief legislator, the power goes two ways. The check on chief legislator, obviously, president can veto or pocket veto Congress. But on the flip side of that, Congress can override a presidential veto with a 2/3 vote in both chambers. The courts can also block executive orders or executive decisions. So if the executive order is deemed unconstitutional, the Supreme Court can block those as well, as you saw with the executive orders of Trump wanting to kick out all the people coming in from Muslim worlds. So that's one. The ultimate check, however, on the president is obviously impeachment. As we saw, impeachment happened, first one with Johnson, and there's the lovely ticket in 1868 to admit you to the Senate hearing of impeachment for President Johnson. Clinton was impeached as well, and then Trump was also impeached. The difference obviously being impeachment and then found guilty. So impeachment is the process of, we have investigated and found that you have committed some wrongdoing, and then Senate is the one who actually holds that hearing and determines whether they are guilty or not. And so Clinton was found not guilty, and Trump was also found not guilty. But all three of these presidents were actually formally impeached. Nixon was the other one that most people are like, oh, he was impeached and he was kicked out of office. There was a threat of impeachment and they were investigating. He was never impeached. He actually resigned before in the impeachment process. All right, succession to the president, that was established in 1947 in case something happened to the president and he died, beyond the vice president. So obviously succession is the vice president is first, then it goes to the Speaker of the House, the Senate pro tempore, which would be the President of the Senate, Secretary of State, Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of Defense, Attorney General, Secretary of the, so these are all the cabinet positions: Interior or Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services, Urban Development, Transportation, Energy, Education, Veterans, and I can't read the last one. The one thing that you do need to realize is that the secretary departments are set in order, and they are set by the president. Most of the time they stay the same, but those will definitely change depending on congressional legislation and or the president's desires. So the first are always the same: vice president, Speaker of the House, Senate pro tempore, Secretary of State. Then pretty much all the departments after that can change, although most of them do not. I haven't seen a change in this in quite some time. So if something were to happen to President Trump, his line of succession, well, his Secretary of State used to be Rex Tillerson, but obviously he fired him. So now it is Mike Pompeo. We've had an election since I actually had this graphic up, so it's not Paul Ryan anymore. Speaker of the House is Nancy Pelosi, and Senate President pro tempore is Greeley, so it's not Orrin Hatch anymore. Secretary of Treasury is the same. That's Stephen Mnuchin. I believe he's still the same. Mateus, I think he just fired him. Attorney General is Jeff Sessions. Secretary of Labor is no longer Alexander Acosta. He fired him. It's now Eugene Scalea. Secretary of Agriculture is now Sonny Perdue, no longer the guy that was down there. And then Alex Azar is still Secretary of Human and Health Services. So those are the new successions to the president at this point if something were to happen to President Trump between now and December. All righty. Your assignment this week is Decisions That Shook the World. I suggest you take notes of the video. The video is about 45 minutes long. We will be doing Reagan, not Johnson. That's the link on your assignment sheet. And make sure that you understand those powers. You will be looking for specific actions and examples. So there will be two things you need to do. One, explain the role you want to highlight. So let's say you want to do chief of state or head of state. Explain what that role is, and then provide specific examples from the film on what Reagan did and how he demonstrated that power. We are looking at the Cold War, so most of it is involving ending the Cold War, but pretty much almost every single world power that we talked about is demonstrated in the film. So enjoy this week's assignment. I will have no more lectures this week, so I will see you later on, hopefully in Zoom during study lab, so that you can get some help or I can answer some questions from you. Much easier to do it at once during Zoom than to have a back and forth email conversation where I might not catch all of your confusion or misunderstandings. So hopefully I see you in Zoom this week, and I will talk to you soon.